Hi, welcome back. In this video, I want to walk you through the entire drawing process of my imaginative drawing project named Hope. So grab your tools and let's get started. These are the art supplies I'm going to use for this drawing, and you can pause the video right here to note them down. I'm using this premium 350 GSM paper by Gruppo Cordinoz, which was imported from Belgium, and the drawing portion area is 24 x 24 inches. But the surface of this paper is quite similar to the ordinary chart paper, so you can use whichever is available. You don't need to spend too much money on expensive papers. I drew this outline using grid method, and you can find the detailed step-by-step process from making the grid to outlining on my Patreon profile. Link is in the description. Now let's list down the color shades I will be using in this drawing. I'm just moving the color scale over the reference image and writing down the color codes on a separate paper. If you don't have a color scale, you can make one at home by watching this video from the cards. Now first of all, I'm lightening the outline using an eraser so that it doesn't peek through the future layers of colors. Okay, so before shading, I'm darkening the outline of the petals using Yellow 107. I'm using my Faber-Castell Polychromos color pencils. I've compared the shades of Faber-Castell Classic with Polychromos and created a list for your convenience. You can pause the video right here to note them down. And then defining the outline of the seeds portion using 217 with a very light pressure. Now as I have darkened the outline of the required area, I'm now lightening it by erasing it with a lighter pressure. This step will erase excess graphite from the initial outlining process, and you will have this beautiful yellow outline perfect to work on. For the first petal, I was experimenting with different colors and techniques so that I can make it as easy as I can for you guys. So you can skip this petal coloring and choose the method I will follow for the next petals, as I was not satisfied with the outcome of this first one. Okay, so moving on to the next petals, and firstly I'm filling the petal with higher pressure using 107. Now before filling the rest of the petals, I'm using 187 and adding the small curved strokes for the definition of the petals. And then using the same 107 and filling in the rest of the petals with a base layer. Notice that I'm keeping my pencil at a higher angle and pressure to get a fully filled and opaque base layer without any unfilled spots. And then I used the 187 again to define the shapes and add contrast in the petals. I'm keeping the angle and pressure on the pencil variable to achieve different shades and tones depending on the area I'm working on. This step will add depth in the petals and separate them from each other. Now to add some definition to the petals, I'm using a white 101 and adding the softer highlights, mainly focusing on the center of the petals. Along with adding softer highlights, this layer will also help in blending sharp ends of the contrast layer we have added before. Now to further lighten the center of the petals, I'm using my Perfection eraser and going over the required areas in circular scribbling motion to achieve blended highlights. Okay, so as the softer highlights are done, now it's time to make the petals more 3D and realistic. So for that, I'm firstly sharpening my Mono 0 eraser by rubbing it vertically on sandpaper. This way you will achieve sharp corners all around the tip. And that is perfect for adding thin highlights, and you also don't have to sharpen the tip again and again. Just rotate the eraser and keep erasing until all the sharp corners are used. I'm adding these intricate highlight strokes in between the darker strokes to create this 3D effect. Now as the highlights are done, I'm going to add another layer of contrast over the previous strokes. This step will make the petals pop up a little bit more. I'm repeating the similar process for other petals as well. Notice that the petals at the back have more contrast and shadows as compared to the front ones. So add these small details accordingly by keeping the reference image in mind. Now as the petals are done, let's move on to the seeds part, and first of all I'm adding a base layer using red 217. I'm adding this layer with a higher pressure to fill the area thoroughly. Okay, so as the base layer is done, I'm now extending the outline outwards by adding these small strokes. Make sure to add them in variable size and direction to mimic the natural appearance of the seeds portion. Okay, now to add contrast, I'm using black 199 and adding this layer in circular scribbling motion, mainly focusing on the inner portion. I'm keeping the high pressure on my color while working on the center and decreasing the pressure gradually as I move away from the center. This will create a perfect contrast gradient just like the way I want. Okay, now for the edge of this center seed portion, I'm keeping my pencil at a lower angle and adding contrast with higher pressure. I'm starting from the edge and then moving towards the center and also decreasing the pressure. It will create a very soft and blended end. Okay, now I'm adding another layer again in circular scribbling motion to intensify this shade. Sunflower centers are commonly filled with small, densely packed seeds. So for that, I'm using my sharp tip electric razor and adding these small dots. I'm adding these dots for the seeds randomly, mainly focusing on the outer edge first, and then creating this circular band of dots. Make sure to keep your razor sharp while adding these small and intricate textures. You can sharpen the tip of your electric razor using a fine grit sandpaper with a grit size between 300 to 500. Or you can also use this Faber-Castell scraper or lead sharpener for this purpose. And then adding another band of dots which are lighter and smaller as compared to the previous ones, especially around this center part. And then I'm going to fill this empty space between these bands. Okay, now I'm using a black color and adding a softer layer over the dots to blend them with the center and to create a hollow and 3D effect. I'm going back and forth with my colors to add final touches and to achieve desired results. Okay, so now moving on to the stem and leaves portion, and first of all I'm lightening the outline by erasing it with a lighter pressure using an ordinary eraser, and then darkening the outline using dark green 173. Along with defining the outline, it will also add slight contrast that I want at the edges. Now I'm adding a base layer in the leaf using lighter green 168 and filling the area thoroughly with a higher pressure. Make sure to cover all nooks and corners to achieve a uniform base. And now it's time to add contrast, and for that I'm using 173 again and adding these slightly curved strokes and lines in the areas which are darker in the reference image. This layer will immediately bring life to the leaf. Then I'm using my blender pencil and going over it to blend with these layers together. Blending helps create smooth transition between different layers, such as contrast, shadows, and highlights, making the artwork appear more realistic. Now as the light is hitting the edge of the leaf, so it is lighter and has brighter highlights. So for that I'm firstly using an electric razor and adding these slightly curved strokes along the edge of the leaf. And then to blend and further lighten the area, I'm using a white color and going over the previous highlights. This will blend any harsh edges made by the electric razor and give the leaf a 3D look. Now I'm cleaning the spill of the color using my electric razor to give the leaf a crisp outline. Then to add more depth in the leaf, I'm using black 199 and adding shadows in these required areas. I'm going back and forth with my tools to achieve these hyper-realistic results. And by the way, you can get access to our premium content and support this channel through Patreon. You can sign up through different membership levels and get access to all the outline and grid references, etc. We have an ever-growing library of hundreds of exclusive and real-time tutorials, and you will also get access to 4 new tutorials every month. You can also post your artworks in our active community of patrons and participate in our weekly critique sessions where I give my honest and positive critiques on your artworks, so you can improve your skills and get better with your drawing. Visit the link in description and become a premium member today. Okay, now moving on to the stem, and I'm using a similar process as I did for the leaf portion. Notice that I'm keeping the pressure on my pencil high for the left portion of the stem and gradually decreasing it while moving towards the right side to achieve a perfect gradient. And now I'm using a white color and adding a layer of highlights on the right side as the light is hitting from this side, making it brighter. Now to mimic the texture of the stem, I'm using my sharp tip 173 and adding the texture in circular scribbling motion. This technique will create very small and intricate texture details which will make the stem look more realistic. And then to add shadows on the left side, I'm using a black color and shading the area with a lighter pressure to avoid any harsh edges. Now adding the final layer of highlights using a white color. Moving on to the next leaf, and as we can see in the reference image that it is folded and almost half of the lower portion is not being exposed, which is darker than the top portion. So I'm firstly darkening the outline and then adding a base layer in this lower portion first using 173 and then adding another layer over it by using 168 to add a tint of brighter green to it. I'm adding a base layer in the rest of the leaf using 173 with a lower angle and pressure. Now I'm using my blender pencil and blending the base layer thoroughly. Notice that I'm only blending the upper lighter portion of the leaf because we need shadows and contrast in the lower portion. And after blending, it is very difficult to achieve required darkness. I almost forgot to include these curved details on the upper edge of the leaf. That's why I'm using my electric razor to remove some portions and achieve the required irregular outline. And then blending the rest of the portion using a blender pencil. Now to add shadows, I'm using 173 again and adding these strokes with a higher pressure. To blend these layers and to add subtle highlights, I'm using a white color and going over the previous layers. Okay, so for the texture on the leaf, I'm adding these small dots with low angle and higher pressure very carefully using 173. Make sure to keep the reference image in mind while adding such details, as small mistakes can make the overall look of that part unrealistic and flat. To add highlights, I firstly used white pencil and added softer ones in between the darker texture. And now to further highlight the area and to lift up some of the excess shade, I'm using my clean and sharp tip perfection eraser and going over the required areas very carefully. And then defining the lower outline of the leaf by adding this thin line with higher pressure using 173. I'm going back and forth with my tools to further fine tune these details. Okay, now it's time to add the small dotted texture, and for that I'm using my sharp tip electric razor. I'm adding these small dots only in the highlighted areas and then going over them with a blender pencil to slightly blend them with the previous layers later on. For the third leaf, I'm repeating the similar process of darkening the outline first and then adding base layer. And then adding curved strokes for the contrast and texture and then blending it with a white color later on. Then adding another layer to add a tint of brighter green over the previous layer. And for the highlights and texture, I'm using my sharp tip electric razor and refining the previous texture. Okay, as the flower part is completed, let's move on to the shoe portion. And I'm darkening the outline first and then adding a base layer using my 5B pencil. As the whole shoe has a darker tone, so while using a 5B pencil, you have to apply higher pressure to achieve required intensity of shade. So to make the process quick and to avoid visible strokes due to pencil shading, I switched towards the 8B graphite powder. Notice that I'm adding this layer in circular scribbling motion to avoid patchiness. If you don't have a graphite powder kit, you can make one at home by watching this video from the cards. I'm repeating the similar process for the remaining portion while keeping the reference image in mind. Okay, now as the base layer is done, I'm adding contrast and shadows in the required areas using my 8B pencil. I always like to draw from my imagination, and previously I used to compile the whole references with photo manipulation to roughly visualize my ideas, and then I used to convert them into drawings. But nowadays we have different AI models to help with this visualization process, which makes it a lot easier and quicker. So I use different AI models to generate my rough ideas and then compile them in Photoshop later on. Most of the time it turns out perfect, but sometimes it messes up the minor yet important details. Like this time it generated the shoelaces placement somehow wrong, and I didn't realize it until I already shaded half of the shoe. I corrected the alignment of the shoelaces later in this video. So as for now, you can leave this portion and wait for the corrected version. Okay, so now I'm blending this layer using tissue paper. And for the details and texture on this pull loop, I'm adding these small slanting lines using a sharp tip perfection eraser. I'm adding contrast around the eyelets and other darker areas to achieve desired depth. Contrast makes things in drawing look clear. It helps you see where one thing ends and another begins, and makes the small details more noticeable. When you use light and shadow together, it makes your drawing more 3D and realistic. So to add subtle highlights and lighter details, I'm using my perfection eraser and lifting up the excess graphite from the lighter areas very carefully. Now to get a sharp outline, I'm erasing this spill of graphite using a mono zero eraser, and then using the same eraser to make the previous highlights pop up a little bit more. Make sure to clean the tip of your mono zero eraser more oftenly while adding such intricate details for more crisp and fine results. And then using an electric razor with a sharp tip to add this extra bright highlight. I'm going back and forth with my tools to achieve desired texture and detail. Now to make the illusion of slight fold on the shoe, I'm adding a soft curved highlight using a perfection eraser. And make sure to clean the tip of the perfection eraser in between the highlighting process by rubbing it on a sandpaper or a scraper like this. I'm also extending it a little bit up as I move forward to achieve a diffused look with the background. Okay, now moving on to the next portion of the shoe, and I'm repeating the similar process as I did before. I'm also making a seam texture by adding small dots first and then extending them a little bit to add a thin line later on. The rest of the shading process is similar to the previous one. As we move towards the front portion, it looks more torn, with a lot of scratches, dirts, and even a ripped seam. So I'm making sure to include all these small details in my drawing to make it as hyper realistic as I can. Now I'm adding these dotted texture first using my 8B pencil. And for the upper seam portion, I'm adding small lines for variable length and direction using my 4B pencil. I'm using a 4B pencil because I found it lying around with a round tip. So I decided to use it to create this texture. However, you can use the same 8B pencil but make sure it has a round tip to achieve this type of soft yet darker texture. I'm adjusting the contrast using 4B pencil in the required areas to create depth and 3D look, and then lightly blending this layer using a medium-sized dry brush. To make the layer more smooth, I always go with tissue paper or cotton ball and blend it in circular scribbling motion. And also in this type of leather texture, it is quite important to have a smooth and blended layer to make it look realistic. Okay, now to lift up some of the excess graphite, I'm using a kneaded eraser and lightening the areas that are a little bit higher and brighter due to folds. I'm using a dabbing motion to target specific areas. It will help in getting an even layer. Okay, now it's time to add fine and detailed lighter texture over and in between the darker ones using Perfection Eraser. Mixing lighter and darker texture in graphite drawing is very important because it helps make your art look more 3D and realistic. It can create depth, highlight important details, and show how light and shadow works. And learning how to control and balance these texture is very important skill for an artist to make their drawing more realistic and detailed. So don't forget to add these teeny tiny dots above the seam, as it will immediately make the area pop up a little bit more. Again, you can watch the real-time video of this drawing on my Patreon profile. Link is in the description. Now to add brighter highlights, I'm going to use my sharp tip mono zero eraser and adding these small strokes over the previous one to make them look more prominent. I'm going back and forth with my tools to perfect the details until I'm satisfied with the results. Okay, now it's time to add highlights and texture to the front seam, and for that I'm firstly adding a base layer of lighter texture using Perfection Eraser. I'm adding a mixture of these small strokes and lines with variable pressure to achieve required results. Now to make it look torn and scratched, I'm using my 4B pencil and adding these random lines and dots to mimic this texture. I'm also lightening the required areas using Perfection Eraser as I did earlier. Now to make the texture of small fibers, I'm using my sharp tip mono zero eraser and adding these small highlights very carefully. Then further fine-tuning the texture by adding depth around it using a 4B pencil and then blending it afterwards. Okay, so now it's time to fix these laces, and I'm erasing some portions of the previous ones first and then redrawing them correctly, just like this. Okay, now as you can see, all the loops of the shoelaces are crossing over each other in correct pattern. So as the outlining is done, let's add the base layer in all the loops using a 4B pencil with lower pressure. As we know that the light source is at the right side, so I'm adding shadows on the left side of the laces to make them appear more 3D. I'm blending this layer using a medium-sized dry brush very carefully to avoid any unwanted blending or smudging. And to reach those nooks and corners, I'm using a small blending stump with a sharp tip to blend all the small areas that are left untouched. Okay, now to make the folds on the quarter, I'm firstly erasing the edge and then defining it using a 4B pencil, and then adding the contrast in the laces using the same pencil. It will create depth on and around them, giving the illusion of 3D look instead of looking flat. Okay, so now I'm using my Perfection Eraser with a clean and sharp tip to add soft highlights on the right side of the laces. And to further fine-tune the highlights, I'm using my mono zero eraser and defining the outline of the leaf first, as some of the sharpness faded away during the shading of the shoe. Then adding these small lines, mainly focusing on the front side of the quarters to create a texture of torn, scratched leather. Okay, so let's move on to the next portion, and I'm firstly darkening the outline using 4B pencil, and then adding a base layer using an 8B graphite powder with a dry brush in circular scribbling motion. Now to fill the left out portions around the outline and to add contrast, I'm using a 4B pencil and then blending the layer afterwards. To create this darker sole texture, I'm firstly adding horizontal lines and strokes, and then adding these small random lines for the upper portion of the sole to create this scratched rubber texture. Now let's move on to the highlights, and I'm adding these horizontal strokes in between the darker ones using Perfection Eraser. And then to make this scratched rubber texture look more 3D, I'm using my sharp tip mono zero eraser and adding these small details. I'm going back and forth with my tools to achieve the desired results. Okay, let's move on to the rest of the shoe portion, and I'm repeating the similar process of darkening the directional lines first and then adding a base layer in the required areas. The only difference is in the texture, as the front portion has more details. So for the texture of the seam on the toe cap portion, I'm adding these horizontal lines first and making them irregular to mimic the torn up effect, and then adding these small dots and extending them a little bit up and down to create scratches on the left portion of the cap. For the longer scratches, I'm adding very thin slant lines close together, and then repeating the similar process for the toe cap and sole top as well. Okay, now it's time to add lighter texture, and this top portion is the lightest. So I'm lifting up the excess graphite using my Perfection Eraser. Then adding these small horizontal strokes on the seam portion, and it immediately makes it pop up, and lightening all those areas which are lighter in the reference image. I'm using my flat tip mono zero eraser and adding these tiny strokes in between and over the previous ones to mimic the bright, intricate texture. Notice that I'm changing the direction of the strokes depending upon the areas I'm working on. I'm going back and forth with my tools to perfect the details as much as I can to achieve hyper realistic results. Now for the sole portion, I'm adding small strokes and dots and then extending them to achieve the desired base for future layers of texture. And I'm also adding slant horizontal lines in the required areas respectively. Okay, now moving on to the lighter texture and highlights, and I'm working in the chunks. Adding the first layer using a Perfection Eraser and then fine tuning it with mono zero eraser later on. And to make them pop up a little bit more, I'm using my sharp tip electric razor and adding these small dots and texture over the previous ones. This will create this texture of dirt. I'm repeating the similar process for the rest of the sole to create realistic texture. And to add the final details and touches to the shoes, I'm adding these small random lines on the quarter near the seam, and this will amp up the whole look of the shoe. Now let's add the shadow beneath the shoe using a graphite powder with a medium sized draw brush, and then I'm going to blend it afterwards. This small detail will bring all the previous details and layers together by giving the whole drawing a realistic look. And with this last step, we are done with this hyper realistic life-size imaginative drawing. It takes so much time and efforts to create this tutorial, so please leave a like if you enjoyed this one. It helps me a lot as an artist. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.